Yeah, it feels like the most natural thing in the world. Vice presidents becoming president of the United States didn't fail rarely, but today we will look at those vice presidents who actually became president of the United States, no matter which way. Welcome to the Washington History Show. And the first vice president in American history already became president of the United States. John Adams, a founding father, served as George Washington's vice president for 8 years and then became president of the United States himself. He probably looked like the best successor for Washington to people back then, but I'd say history doesn't see in him the successor people probably hoped he'd be back then. Differently for Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson was John Adams' vice president for 4 years, then challenged him in the next election and won. He was also a founding father who wrote the Declaration of Independence. As a president, I'd say his legacy is mainly the Louisiana Purchase. What I can say about Jefferson is, I guess I never heard someone saying he'd be better than George Washington, but I also never heard someone saying he'd be a bad president, and therefore he got his place next to George Washington on Mount Rushmore. Then it took a while until the next vice president became president of the United States, but in 1837, Andrew Jackson's vice president, Martin van Buren, became president of the United States by an election. Both Jackson and Van Buren are controversial presidents, I'd say. Very generally, I'd say Jackson is rather seen as the better president. Then in 1841, there was the first time in American history the situation that an acting American president died. William Henry Harrison died only a month after becoming president of the United States. Then his vice president, John Taylor, became president of the United States. And as the situation occurred for the first time, it was still unclear whether Taylor could be seen as a full American president. Some rather saw him still as being vice president and doing some president's duties interim. However, Taylor insisted that he should be seen as a full president, and the Congress agreed with that, and this also set the standard for future American presidents, for future American vice presidents who moved up. They'd always be a full American president. And the next time an American president died was in 1850, where Zachary Taylor suddenly died only 1.5 years after entering office. With that, Millard Fillmore became president of the United States, who by the way passed a law Zachary Taylor had announced he would use his veto against. Just like John Tyler, he wasn't elected for a known term. However, Tyler didn't run for a known term anyway, but Millard Fillmore tried to be re-elected, didn't win, and later ran again with a third party called the Know Nothing Party. Yes, that was really their name. And the next time a vice president became president of the United States was again after a president's death. Andrew Johnson became president of the United States in 1865 after Abraham Lincoln's assassination. This was the only time in American history a Republican had a Democrat as his vice president. Johnson, however, was the first president in American history where it was tried to remove him from office without success, but in general he's seen as one of the worst presidents in American history. Lincoln, however, wasn't the last assassinated president. In 1881, the same year he had become president, James Garfield was assassinated. Garfield died a few days after being shot. And the moment Garfield was shot, the assassin, however, said, "Now Arthur is president." Chester Arthur was James Garfield's vice president. Back then, in the Republican Party, there were two camps. Chester Arthur and James Garfield belonged to different camps. There were the so-called stalwarts Chester Arthur belonged to, and the half-breeds Rutherford Hayes belonged to. As Rutherford Hayes won the Republican nomination as a compromise, Chester Arthur, a stalwart, was chosen to be his vice president. And the next vice president, who became president of the United States, is someone everyone knows. In 1901, William McKinley died in office, and he was also assassinated. With that, his vice president, Theodore Roosevelt, moved up to the office of American president. At the age of 42 years, he therefore became the youngest president in American history. Furthermore, Theodore Roosevelt was the first vice president who moved up and later was re-elected, and he is mainly seen as one of the best presidents in American history and also got his place on Mount Rushmore. The next time an American president needed to be replaced was in 1923. On a trip to San Francisco, the acting president, Warren Harding, suddenly died. That Calvin Coolidge became president of the United States, sworn in by his own father. He was president in the Golden 20s, but also before the looming economical crisis. And the next time an American president died was in 1945, shortly before the end of World War II. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who had served from 1933 up to 1945, suddenly died. Harry Truman, who had shortly before become Franklin Roosevelt's third vice president, took over. He was president when the war finally ended in Germany, and he accelerated the end of the war with Japan by dropping the atomic bombs over Nagasaki and Hiroshima. Surprisingly, he was also re-elected in 1948. He was also responsible for the foreign politics after World War II and at the beginning of the Cold War. Probably the most popular president's death was John F. Kennedy's. In 1963, the popular president was assassinated in Dallas. With that, Lyndon Johnson, his vice president, became president of the United States. He was also re-elected in 1964, and he passed the Civil Rights Act. That was before the election, but he also lost popularity because of the happenings in Vietnam, a war the United States entered in his term. And Johnson's successor was also a former vice president of the United States, Richard Nixon. Nixon had served as Dwight Eisenhower's vice president in the 1950s until 1961. Nixon is mainly remembered for the Watergate scandal and creating diplomatic relations with China. However, due to the Watergate scandal, Nixon became the first and so far only president in American history who resigned from office. With that, Gerald Ford became president of the United States. The special thing about Gerald Ford is that he was not elected as vice president. He became vice president after Nixon's actual vice president, Spiro Agnew, had to resign from office. Different scandal than Watergate, but that made Gerald Ford the only president in American history who was neither elected as vice president, with the ticket as running mate, nor as president himself, because he lost the re-election in 1976 to Jimmy Carter. However, Gerald Ford was also the last vice president who became president after moving up. The next vice president who became president was George Bush Sr. He was the first vice president who was elected as American president without moving up before since Martin van Buren in 1837. In his term, the Cold War ended, not really causally related, but an important information, I guess. The last vice president who became president of the United States was Joe Biden, who had served as Barack Obama's vice president from 2009 to 2017 and became president of the United States in 2021. I guess there's nothing I could say you don't know anyway, so if you don't want to miss any more content about American history, I'd be very glad if you subscribe to the channel. I really appreciate that. And if you also want to know about the two vice presidents who both became president and both died on the same day, check out this video here, and I'll say thank you for watching.